Alright, so today we're going to address the question, should Christians play video games? At least 1,000 times a day, people are asking this on Reddit, on Quora, on the Christian forums, wherever you go, people are asking this questions. Should Christians play video games? Can I play Doom? Can I play Starfield? Can I play Grand Theft Auto 5? Whatever the new game that is coming out is, people are going to ask that question of can I play it? Can I play it? So, it is time to address it. As always, I'll be addressing things as a Catholic because I am Catholic. That's the only point of view that I can address it from. However, this should be general advice that applies to all Christians. So, as always, when we're talking about can I play video games, is it a sin to play video games, is it wrong to play video games, we need to ask that question of why are we asking, why do we think it's a sin? Why do you think playing video games is a sin? It's very helpful when we're trying to determine whether or not we can do something, whether or not something's wrong, to determine why do we think that it is. It's also important to note that there is such a thing as scrupulosity, scruples, or religious OCD, where we think too many things are a sin, and it can become a debilitating actual medical condition. Some examples of that are when people ask things like, can I eat hot sauce if it has Diablo or the devil in it? Can I go to that one country or city that's named Hell? Is it a sin to like the color black? Now, these are obviously very specific and kind of outrageous questions, but when you're suffering from the religious OCD, it becomes an everyday part of your life, and it can be very hard to overcome. So when we're asking these questions, we need to ask, is this religious OCD, is this scrupulosity, or is this actually something that could be a sin? And to determine if something is a sin, the best way to look to those is to look to the 10 Commandments and the 7 deadly sins. And the Bible, of course, but it should come as no surprise. Obviously, the Bible says 0 things about video games. You know, the Bible came out a few years before the first couple video games like Pong and all that, right? So we look to the 10 Commandments and we look to the 7 deadly sins to kind of form our conscience around this and be able to determine, can we do this? Is this a sin? So, a quick reminder, 10 Commandments, we have, I, the Lord, am your God. You shall have no other gods beside me. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember to keep the Lord's day. Honor your mother and father. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. Shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. And you shall not covet your neighbor's goods. And then the 7 deadly sins, we have anger, envy, gluttony, greed, lust, pride, and sloth. So, the first question we should ask is, do video games fit into these things? Could a video game violate one of these sins or commandments? And honestly, I would say yes. I think Commandment 1, 4, 7, and deadly sins of anger, gluttony, lust, pride, sloth are all in danger of being on those. Now, there is some people who would argue the commandment, you shall not kill and you shall not bear false witness, also play in there. I don't agree with that, but we're going to talk about it because people insist that it does, so we will bring that up a little bit later. Now, it's also important to note that you're probably a couple minutes into this video and I just clicked on this video because I want an answer. Can I play video games? Yes or no? And it doesn't obviously always break down into just yes or no categories. Oftentimes, the easy, fast answer is not the correct answer. So, because I want to address this question as a whole, this is going to be a little bit more in-depth and long of a video because we are going to be going through each one of these things and really breaking it down. Do video games break any of these rules? So I'm not going to just give you an easy yes or no answer. Usually at the beginning of my videos, I like to put an answer right in there for people who are looking for that, who don't want clickbait, who don't want to go through everything. I get it, but really for this video, we need all this thorough explanation. There is no just yes or no answer. I also want to note that there is not a one-size-fits-all answer. Even if we get through all this and we say, yes, you can play video games, it may not be right for you. And it may be certain video games you avoid. There are, of course, lots of categories. Video games is a huge thing, from arcade games and Pong to more recent Grand Theft Auto 5. There's a bunch of adult games on Steam. And then you've got MMOs. So there's categories, right? So one answer doesn't fit each person and doesn't fit the category. If you find video games a hindrance to your faith, then that can be the easy answer for you. No, don't play video games if it hinders your faith. There, now you can click off the video, you're done. However, my brief general answer I usually give to people is that if a video game does not cause you to sin, cause other people around you to sin, does not cause you to lose faith, and does not cause scandal, and does not support the wrong things, then generally it might be okay to play. But what causes one person to struggle and fall and another person to struggle and fall may be completely different things. So, with that huge disclaimer said, let's break down the arguments for each commandment, deadly sin, and see if they hold water. I also want to take a moment here to quote Corinthians, everything is lawful for me, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is lawful for me, but I will not let myself be dominated by anything. Now, not trying to take the Bible out of context, I know that is definitely an issue. This is usually in regards to sexual morality. However, I think there's great wisdom in this particular passage in saying just because I'm saying something is lawful or you can do something doesn't mean that it is beneficial for you. And that's a question we really need to dig deep into ourselves and ask, just because I can do this, is it beneficial for me to do it? So, on to the first commandment. Christians should not play video games because it violates the first commandment, thou shalt not have no other gods besides me. Or thou shalt have no other gods besides me. I put one too many negatives in there. So this one is usually about idolatry. Now, I think it'd be very hard to actually worship a video game as an idol, to actually like move into the realm where you think that a video game is actually God or has godlike qualities. I do think there's been some very addicting games where that has been a very, very rare case for people. World of Warcraft comes to mind, where people were worshipping it day and night, playing it day and night, foregoing eating, drinking, sleeping, their jobs, their families, all that. I think there is a possibility for that, but I think that's very rare. I think more commonly on this one, we have the video game adjacent things. You have content creators, YouTubers, the irony, streamers, that sort of thing, where the promise of fame, riches, popularity becomes more important than God, and I think that could be a real concern for a violation of the first commandment, where becoming popular, becoming the most popular streamer, making money off of streamer, having people recognize you becomes more important to God. I think that could definitely become a false idol. So that could be a reason to say, no, we shouldn't play video games. But again, this is for each individual person. If you don't struggle with that, then let's move on to the next one. Honor thy mother and father. This one's really easy. If you're still living with your parents and they say no video games, what are you gonna do? We have to honor thy mother and father. I think that's a reasonable request. Now, there is, of course, room for you to have discussions with your parents in a lot of things that I'm not qualified. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not in your personal shoes to be able to know your relationship with your parents. So that's up for your individual discernment. If you yourself are a parent, the question would then become, are you neglecting your kids for video games? Are you neglecting their education, their spiritual growth? Are you skipping church to play video games instead of taking your kid to mass? Those are the sort of things where it becomes potentially a hindrance to the fourth commandment. This next one should be obvious, thou shalt not steal, but there's a huge argument on whether or not is piracy theft, is it actually stealing? I believe it is, and that is a huge topic that I'll have to do a video on another time. I would say definitely that if you are taking a video game that costs money and you're not paying them for it, you are stealing it. I've heard a lot of rationalization for it. I've heard a lot of people try and justify it, saying, oh, well, you're just arranging ones and zeros. You're not actually taking anything. I don't care about all that. It's theft. It's plain out theft. And in most places, it's against the law. So even if you can't say that it's theft, you are called to still follow the law of the land, and so it's against the law, so it is a violation of that. So if playing video games is causing you to steal video games, that is a problem. That is an obvious problem. Now, there are a lot of people who bring up the thou shalt not kill or lie. There are extreme individuals who will claim that every time you kill someone in a video game, every time you lie in a video game, every sin that you commit in a video game is an extension of yourself, and thus that is your sin that you are committing. I think that is absolutely ridiculous. So here are 3 arguments why I don't think that holds water. 1, games are just stories and art. If we're holding responsible for the sins in video games, then the creator of those video games would also be committing sins by creating it. Remember that, like, Jesus created stories and art, the parables. Is he responsible for the sins that he brought up in those parables? No, absolutely not. So why would it be the same for game creators? Now, this does not mean that you should do those sins in video games. I'm not saying that, like in Grand Theft Auto 5, you should go access the pornographic content. Obviously, you should not do that. But saying that every single sin done in a video game is your sin is ridiculous, because argument 2, if you're responsible for the sins committed in video games, then you should also be responsible for all the sins committed in any other fantasy game or any other genre, which means board games. So now family board game all of a sudden becomes a whole lot worse. You're playing Battleship? That's a paddling, right? You're killing people in Battleship. Monopoly? You can literally go to jail for committing some unknown crimes, right? That's a paddling. Not to mention every board game that requires you to lie. You know, there's a ton of games out there now. Cards Against Humanity, Apples to Apples, Malarkey, just a few off the top of my head that require you to lie about what's in your hand or deceive people. Well, that's a paddling. Guess what? Family game night is a lot less wholesome now that you're all sinning around the board game. Argument 3 is that this would also include TV. You're watching people sin. You're a part of that story. In fact, by watching it, you're supporting it, which is making the writers write these sinful things even more, right? This is absolutely horrible. Sin upon sin upon sin. So if you're going to say that you're accountable for the sins in video games, then you're also accountable for the sins that you would see in TV, in board games, in stories, and obviously none of that makes sense. So those are the 3 arguments I would use to say why that argument does not hold water. And, you know, 3 is an important number in the Bible. It comes up a lot. So if 3 is good enough for God, it's good enough for me. I don't think there's any proof you could back up saying sins in video games or sins in real life. So, from the commandments, let's move on to the deadly sins: anger, gluttony, lust, pride, sloth. Starting with anger, that's an emotion that I struggled a lot with, but it is important to remember anger is an emotion. Feeling anger is not necessarily a bad thing, and feeling anger is not necessarily a sinful thing. Remember, even Jesus got angry a few times. So, we're going to quote Catholic answers here. Anger becomes sinful when it is sought to wreak vengeance upon one who has not deserved it, or to a greater extent than it has been deserved, or in conflict with the dispositions of law, or from an improper motive. The sin is then, in a general sense, mortal, as being opposed to justice and charity. So playing a game like Dark Souls, it might be frustrating, but you might enjoy it. Being angry at Dark Souls does not constitute sin or wrongfulness. But if you take that anger and frustration out on someone else because the video game made you mad, and now you're unjustly responding to something else in anger, that could be a problem. The anger sin here is more directed towards, like, Call of Duty is a great example, where people are playing multiplayer, you get shot by someone and you're starting to scream racial slurs and death threats to 7-year-olds. Obviously, that's a problem. That's where that anger can start to lead to sin. Gluttony, now this one typically deals with food, but we're talking about moderation, right? Gluttony can be anything that you are doing immoderately. Too much of anything can be a bad thing, and video games are no exception here. Emmy and I used to do all-night World of Warcraft launch night parties. I think a lot of people have fond memories of LAN parties for 24 hours back in the day, and those are great to do every once in a while, right? But if a video game can't be used in moderation, I think that's a sign that we need to quit, fast, or limit them, or take a look at our relationship with video games. To give a recent example, Diablo 4 recently came out. After 1 week of it being out, so 24 hours times 7, that's 168 hours that this game had been launched, some people were talking about racking up 100, 120 hours of gameplay. That's 5 days straight of gaming, or across 7 days, about 17 plus hours a day. Assuming that you slept a normal amount, that leaves no other time for any other thing. I can't say that that would be healthy or good, because for most people that means you're neglecting the relationships in your life, neglecting church, neglecting mass, and the obligations. that is where it becomes a problem. So if you can play video games for an hour or two, that's a good thing. But if it becomes a point where you're playing it for 17 hours a day every day and neglecting other things, that's definitely an extreme reaction that needs to be looked at. Another extreme example, World of Warcraft, when it came out, people were literally losing their jobs, they were losing their spouses, losing their kids. There's even one tragic story of a kid who lost his life, I believe in China. He sat down to play World of Warcraft and just never moved from the chair and ended up dying in the chair after playing for, I want to say it was like 3 days straight without eating, sleeping, getting up, doing anything. So obviously there's a line that needs to be drawn. And again, this is not every person, the line is the same place, right? So this isn't a one-size-fits-all. It's something you need to talk to yourself and ask yourself, do I play them too much? Do I neglect other things in my life to play video games? It's an important question. Lust, that's an obvious one. There's a lot of games out there now that have pornographic content. Those should be completely avoided 100%. That shouldn't even be in the discussion. However, there's other popular games. Genshin Impact is one that causes people a lot of stumbling blocks. The characters are obviously made with a lot of sex appeal, and some people get caught up in that. And you should avoid those games if you can't avoid lusting after the characters in the game or having those sort of thoughts, or what we call a near occasion of sin. It's getting you close to those things. It should be avoided. Pride is one that I bring up because pride is sometimes called the queen of sin, or the sin that precedes every other sin. It's a big one, and people misunderstand it, right? They think, oh, pride's a sin, so I can't be proud of anything. That's not the case. I'm going to quote Catholic Answers, who's quoting St. Thomas Aquinas, who's quoting St. Isidore. A man is said to be proud because he wishes to appear above what he really is. Aquinas comments that a man who uses his reason rightly acts proportionate to him, but pride causes a man to have a disproportionate understanding of who he truly is. Therefore, the self-understanding of the prideful man is contrary to his reason and sinful. This is probably a rare thing too, where people conflate their video game achievements with like a real achievement, that they take like a true honest pride. I'm better than people, I'm better than God because of video games. That's rare. That probably doesn't happen. But again, video game adjacent things such as streamers, influencers, YouTubers, again, the irony, I can see where that can cause some real issues, where people in those positions tend to get an inflated ego and come from a place of pride on a lot of things. So it is a real issue that some people may struggle with. Finally, we have sloth. This one goes hand in hand with gluttony, but I think it deserves its own section. So one last time, I'm going to quote Catholic Answers here. Sloth is a sin against God, and not against the time clock or productivity. The fact is that it's possible to work too much, in a way that's not keeping with our dignity and ultimate good. The essence of sloth is a failure to fulfill one's basic duties. Surely, one such duty is the human vocation to work, yet another such duty is the enjoyment of leisure to take time for worship. The gentleman lying on the sofa may be a more popular image of sloth, but the workaholic who's on the job 24/7 and in the process neglects God and family is a much more typical manifestation of sloth in our culture. I bring this up twofold reason. One, some of the people who say no, Christians shouldn't play video games is saying, well, it's a waste of time. Well, that's what hobbies are supposed to be for, right? It's leisure time. It's time to spend in God's creation, appreciating God, relaxing, and spending time with family. You can do that with video games, so you should not avoid it just because people say, oh, well, it's slothful. It's not. But also, again, video game adjacent, when we're talking about streamers, content creators, there's a lot of people who put in hours and hours and hours and hours of work, and there's a real risk for neglecting other parts in your life to try and make that fame, that fortune, make that content to appease the internet. So there's a real issue potentially there, and again, that's different for every person. So we've gone through all this information. I know it was a lot, but the question still stands: should Christians play video games? So here's the answer. If we can honestly look at everything that we just discussed, all those commandments, all the deadly sins, and say, that's not a problem for me, then go nuts. Have fun with your video games. If you're going through those and saying, well, I have some of those problems, or those things do pop up for me, then more discernment may be necessary. And this is going to vary from game to game. It doesn't necessarily fit all games. For example, someone may enjoy Stardew Valley, which is a very simple, peaceful game, good music, you're just planting crops, but they might struggle with Cult of the Lamb, where there's upside down crosses and satanic imagery, cultism and heresy and all those sorts of things. So this is a question that you can ask yourself now. Should Christians play video games? Yes, we can play video games, but before we start playing each individual game, we need to look at it and run it through these lists and say, will it cause me to do any of these sins? Will it cause me to do any of this neglect? Will it harm me in any of those ways? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, then we'll avoid a lot of issues when it comes to should we be playing video games. I hope this video clears things up for you. If you have questions, concerns, of course, put them in the comments, and go have fun with your games, just in moderation.